My sister slid a $4,000 steakhouse bill across the table, laughing that a toaster repair girl like me should be grateful to buy her dinner. She had no idea the billionaire CEO she spent years trying to impress was about to walk into that exact restaurant, bypass her completely, and beg me to save his empire. I am Emma, 35 years old, and somehow still navigating the exhausting reality of being the designated disappointment in my own family. Despite building a highly lucrative cyber hardware firm from the ground up, I am still treated like the dirt beneath their designer shoes. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to sit across from people sharing your DNA while they actively tried to diminish your light. The air inside the most exclusive steakhouse in the heart of Buckhead, Atlanta, was thick with the scent of dry, aged ribeye, melted truffle butter, and the kind of generational wealth that does not need to speak loudly to be heard. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over mahogany tables, illuminating the sharp suits and elegant evening gowns of the city elite. Our table was situated right in the center of the main dining room. It was a prime location my mother Brenda had undoubtedly spent weeks securing, just to prove we belonged among the upper crust. I sat quietly at the edge of the semicircular leather booth, sipping sparkling water and watching the chaotic theater of my family unfold. To my left sat my sister Chloe, perfectly coiffed and dripping in status symbols. At 32, Chloe was a vice president at a massive tech investment conglomerate, and she made sure every person within a 5-mile radius knew it. Next to her was her husband, Julian, a white hedge fund manager who carried his privilege like a loaded weapon. He loved to leverage his old money connections to make me feel small, often dropping names of Ivy League alumni or exclusive country clubs he knew I had no interest in joining. The plates had barely been cleared from our decadent 5-course meal when the waiter approached, stepping softly on the plush carpet. He placed the heavy leather-bound checkbook in the center of the table with a polite nod. Before anyone else could reach for it, Chloe snatched the black leather folder. She flipped it open, her manicured acrylic nails tapping against the gold-embossed paper inside. A cruel, familiar smirk spread across her face. Her dark eyes, so similar to mine but entirely devoid of warmth, locked onto me. Without breaking eye contact, she slid the folder across the polished mahogany surface. It glided smoothly, stopping exactly in front of my water glass. I looked down. The bold ink at the bottom of the receipt read $4,120. I looked back up at her, my expression perfectly blank. Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, making sure her voice was just loud enough to carry to the neighboring tables. Well, Emma, since you decided to be utterly selfish and completely missed contributing to Mom and Dad's anniversary trip to Martha's Vineyard last month, Julian and I discussed it. We think it is only fair that you cover the dinner tonight. Consider it your way of making amends for being such a cheapskate. The immediate silence that fell over our table was deafening. Even the subtle clinking of silverware from the couple dining next to us seemed to pause. I could feel the weight of their curious stares burning into the side of my face. My mother took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive Cabernet, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet and refusing to meet my eyes. She was deeply invested in respectability politics, always terrified of what the neighbors or the church elders might think, yet she was letting this public humiliation happen. She always let it happen. In her eyes, Chloe was the golden child who could do no wrong, the daughter who brought prestige to the family name, while I was simply the dark cloud hovering over their perfect portrait. What Chloe conveniently failed to mention was the real reason I did not contribute to that anniversary trip. Just the year before, I had fully funded a 2-week family vacation to Hawaii, paying for first-class flights and luxury villas out of my own pocket. When we returned, my mother stood up in front of our entire church congregation and publicly thanked Julian for his overwhelming generosity, completely erasing my existence and my financial contribution. I had made a silent vow that day to never let them use my bank account to fund their delusions of grandeur again. A younger, more fragile version of myself might have crumbled under the weight of this public attack. I might have felt the familiar sting of tears pricking the corners of my eyes, or stammered out an excuse or frantically checked my bank account balance with trembling fingers. I might have allowed their cruelty to dictate my worth. But I was no longer that frightened girl seeking validation from people committed to misunderstanding me. I was 35 years old, a self-made woman who commanded boardrooms and salvaged corrupted data systems for Fortune 500 companies. I knew exactly who I was and what I possessed. I simply picked up my glass of water, taking a calm, measured sip. I let the silence stretch, watching Chloe's smirk falter just a fraction of an inch as she waited for my reaction. I was completely used to this routine. It was their favorite game, cornering me in public places where they assumed my desire to be respectable would force me to quietly absorb their abuse. I looked at the extravagant bill, then looked back at my sister, feeling absolutely nothing but a deep, profound pity for her insecurity. Next to Chloe, Julian let out a low, mocking chuckle. He leaned back in the plush leather booth, swirling the amber liquid in his rocks glass, preparing to deliver the punchline he thought would finally break my composure and put me in my place. Julian took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, letting the heavy crystal glass clink softly before he spoke. His voice dripped with the kind of smug satisfaction that only comes from a lifetime of never being told no. "Come on, Chloe, do not overwhelm her. Emma fixes toasters and cracked iPhone screens for a living. You cannot expect a kiosk worker to drop 4 grand on a Tuesday." Julian leaned closer to the table, fixing his pale eyes on me with a mocking grin. "Tell me, Emma, do you guys take payment plans at the mall, or is it strictly cash only for screen replacements?" Julian knew exactly what he was doing. He knew perfectly well that I did not work in a mall kiosk. But to a man born into hedge fund money, a man who built his wealth moving invisible numbers around on screens, any labor that involved building physical systems from the ground up was entirely beneath him. I founded Apex Data Solutions when I was 26. I built proprietary hardware and coded recovery protocols for government contractors and massive financial institutions. But because my hands occasionally touched circuit boards, my family deliberately reduced my entire existence to a running joke about appliance repair. It was their favorite coping mechanism. Diminishing my massive success was the only way they could keep Chloe perched on the precarious pedestal they had built for her. Before I could even formulate a response to his manufactured ignorance, my mother sighed heavily. It was that dramatic, long-suffering sigh she reserved exclusively for my presence. She reached across the table, adjusting the lavish floral centerpiece, as if I was somehow ruining her carefully curated aesthetic. "Julian is exactly right, Chloe," she murmured, shaking her head in profound disappointment. "We really should not have expected her to step up tonight. If Emma had just listened to us 10 years ago and surrendered that college fund for your Wharton tuition, she would not be struggling in the service industry today. But you know your sister, always insisting on doing things the hard way, always so incredibly selfish with her little savings accounts. The absolute audacity of her statement hung in the air, thick and suffocating over the smell of roasted garlic and red wine. The college fund my mother so casually mentioned was not money my parents had saved for me. It was money I had earned working double shifts at a diner throughout high school, combined with an academic scholarship I fought tooth and nail to secure. When Chloe decided she wanted to go to an Ivy League business school to secure her status, my parents sat me down in our living room and demanded I sign over my entire bank account to cover her out-of-state tuition. They explicitly told me that since Chloe was destined for corporate greatness, and I was just a girl who liked tinkering with computers, it was my absolute duty as a sister to sacrifice my future for hers. When I refused to hand over the money I had bled for, they packed my bags and told me I was no longer welcome under their roof. I slept on a mattress on the floor of a freezing studio apartment for 4 years. I ate cheap noodles and built my tech empire line by line of code in the dead of night. Meanwhile, my parents took out massive loans to throw lavish graduation parties for Chloe, and bought her a brand new Mercedes just to celebrate her first entry-level job. They spent a decade convincing themselves that my boundaries were acts of betrayal, framing me as the villain in a story where I was the only one paying my own bills. Now, sitting in this five-star restaurant watching my mother rewrite history to justify their cruelty, I felt a strange sense of absolute peace wash over me. I looked at the three of them sitting across from me. Chloe, with her desperate, gnawing need to prove she was better than me at all costs. Julian propping up his fragile ego by mocking a black woman's labor while spending his trust fund. And my mother willing to throw her own flesh and blood under the bus just to maintain the grand illusion of her perfect, respectable family. They were trapped in a toxic, exhausting cycle of their own making, constantly performing for a society that did not care about them at all. I could have argued with them. I could have pulled out my phone and showed Julian the massive tech magazine cover featuring my company from last month. I could have reminded my mother that the diamond tennis bracelet she was wearing right now, the one she loved showing off to the church elders, was bought with the Christmas bonus I gave her 2 years ago. A bonus she explicitly told her friends was a generous gift from Chloe. I could have raised my voice, caused a massive scene, and given them the angry, unhinged reaction they were so desperately trying to provoke. They wanted me to break. They wanted to see me sweat, to apologize, to beg for their approval just one more time. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the scapegoat internalize their shame. Instead, I leaned back against the plush leather booth. I offered my family a polite, completely detached smile. It was the exact kind of smile you give a stranger who accidentally bumps into you on the sidewalk. Without uttering a single word of protest, I slowly unclasped the heavy gold hardware of my handbag and reached quietly into my purse. My fingers bypassed my standard leather wallet and found exactly what I was looking for. I did not pull out a standard debit card or a basic travel rewards credit card. Instead, I retrieved a solid, heavy piece of anodized titanium. It was the Obsidian Reserve card. In the exclusive world of high finance, it was a ghost. It was an invitation-only tier reserved strictly for ultra-high net worth individuals who push tens of millions of dollars through their private accounts annually. The card possessed no numbers on the front, no flashy bank logos, just a sleek, matte black finish with my name beautifully laser-etched in silver lettering across the center. I pulled my hand from my purse and placed the heavy metal card perfectly dead center on top of the $4,000 receipt. The titanium clinked against the polished mahogany table, making a distinctly solid, weighted sound that immediately caught Julian's attention. Because Julian was a hedge fund manager, his entire existence revolved around identifying wealth, spotting hierarchy, and knowing exactly who held the most power in any given room. I watched his pale eyes dart from my face down to the card and then back up to my face again. The mocking, superior grin he had been wearing completely evaporated. His jaw actually went slack for a fraction of a second. He blinked rapidly, his brain clearly struggling to compute the impossible data sitting right in front of him. Then his fragile ego kicked in frantically, building a bridge of denial over his cognitive dissonance. "Is that a joke?" Emma Julian scoffed, though his voice notably lacked its previous booming confidence. He leaned over, pointing a stiff finger at the card without actually daring to touch it. "You bought a prop card off the internet. What is that, a custom metal skin you pasted over a prepaid debit card to look impressive at restaurants? You cannot possibly expect them to run that piece of metal." I did not even bother dignifying his desperate rationalization with a response. I kept my posture relaxed and my expression entirely unbothered. At that exact moment, our waiter reappeared to collect the checkbook. As the young man reached for the leather folder, his eyes fell on the matte black titanium sitting on top of the bill. His professional demeanor instantly shifted from polite service to absolute undeniable reverence. People who worked in high-end luxury hospitality knew exactly what that specific card meant, and they knew the immense wealth required just to hold it. Right away, Ms. Wilson, the waiter, said, his voice dropping to a hushed, deeply respectful tone. He did not ask for my ID. He did not question the card. He scooped the titanium up, as if he were handling a delicate historical artifact, and hurried away toward the point of sale terminal, moving with a sudden urgency he had not displayed all evening. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his expensive silk tie. He looked over at Chloe silently, waiting for his wife to restore the natural order of things and put me back in my place. Chloe was staring at the empty space on the table where the bill had just been, her meticulously contoured face pulled tight with poorly concealed irritation. She was furiously calculating how a woman she perceived as a lowly appliance repair worker could confidently hand over a prop card without breaking a sweat, or worse, how I could possibly have access to a real one. My mother broke the tense silence, letting out a sharp, disapproving sound from the back of her throat. "Well," Brenda muttered, smoothing her linen napkin over her lap with aggressive, jerky movements, "I suppose if you insist on living completely beyond your means just to make a petty point, we will not stop you. But do not come crying to us when your electricity gets shut off next week. Financial illiteracy is exactly why you have never amounted to anything substantial, Emma. It is embarrassing that you feel the need to show off like this." The waiter returned less than 60 seconds later. He did not hand the receipt book back to Chloe. He walked directly to my side of the booth, bypassing Julian entirely, and presented the silver tray to me with a slight deferential bow. "Your card, Ms. Wilson. The transaction is approved. Thank you so much for your incredible generosity this evening." I had added a $2,000 tip to the bill. I calmly picked up the sleek metal card, slipping it back into my purse, and signed the merchant copy with a steady hand. The machine had not rejected it. There was no embarrassing decline, no manager called over to discreetly handle a fraud alert. The payment had cleared instantly, finalizing a transaction that cost more than what my family believed I made in 2 entire months. The dynamic at the table had fundamentally shifted, and Chloe could feel the ground crumbling beneath her expensive designer heels. She absolutely despised losing control. Her posture went completely rigid, and her dark eyes narrowed into resentful, angry slits. She could not accept the reality that I had just casually absorbed a massive financial blow without begging for mercy. She needed to reframe the narrative immediately to drag me back down into the dirt so she could resume standing on top of me. She took a deep, sharp breath, her chest puffing up beneath her tailored silk blouse. I could practically read the toxic script forming in her mind. She was preparing to launch into a vicious, loud tirade. She was ready to publicly accuse me of spending my rent money, draining my meager savings, or maxing out high-interest credit cards just to desperately show off in front of her successful husband. She opened her mouth, her lips parting to deliver a devastating insult designed to shatter my confidence and restore her status as the golden child. But before a single venomous word could leave her throat, a massive commotion erupted at the maitre d' stand near the front entrance of the restaurant. The heavy double doors of the restaurant swung open with a forceful push, letting in a sudden gust of cool evening air and the flashing lights of a motorcade parked illegally on the curb. A team of broad-shouldered men in dark suits stepped into the foyer first, their eyes scanning the room with calculated precision. The maitre d' abandoned his post, practically tripping over his own feet to clear a path. A hushed murmur rippled through the dining room as patrons paused with their forks halfway to their mouths. Walking right through the center of the chaos was Richard Sterling. He was a man who possessed the kind of wealth that owned senators and shaped skylines. As the billionaire chief executive officer of the massive tech investment conglomerate where my sister worked, he carried a gravitational pull that forced everyone around him to adjust to his orbit. He looked exactly like the corporate titan he was dressed in, a bespoke midnight blue suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his jaw set in an expression of singular focus. He was trailed by 3 executive assistants who were frantically typing on their tablets, struggling to keep up with his long, purposeful strides. I felt a sudden, violent movement beside me. Chloe had frozen mid-breath, the cruel insult she was about to hurl at me dying instantly on her tongue. Her face went completely pale for a fraction of a second before flushing with a frantic, greedy energy. She recognized him immediately. "That is Richard Sterling," she hissed to Julian. her voice trembling with a manufactured reverence that made my stomach turn. Julian instantly sat up straighter, hurriedly adjusting the knot of his silk tie. The arrogant, relaxed posture he had maintained all evening vanished completely. Even Julian, a man who loved to weaponize his own trust fund, was momentarily subdued by the sheer magnitude of a man whose net worth dwarfed his entire hedge fund by several $1 billion. Chloe did not politely ask me to excuse her. She did not wait for me to slide out of the semicircular booth. Driven by blind ambition and the desperate need to be seen, she drove her sharp elbow directly into my shoulder, aggressively shoving me aside to escape the table. She practically leaped into the main aisle, smoothing down the front of her tailored silk blouse and plastering on a painfully artificial wide smile. I watched as her entire persona shifted in the blink of an eye. The vicious, sneering bully who had just tried to publicly humiliate her own sister disappeared entirely. In her place stood a frantic sycophant desperate to climb one more rung on the corporate ladder. She marched toward the center aisle like a soldier heading into battle, deliberately positioning herself directly in the billionaire's walking path. She modulated her voice, dropping the harsh, shrill tone she always reserved for me. Instead, she adopted a breathy, polished cadence, projecting her words loud enough to ensure the surrounding tables knew exactly how important she thought she was. "Mr. Sterling," she called out, stepping forward and extending her hand. "What an absolutely incredible and unexpected honor to see you this evening. I am Chloe Wilson, your Vice President of Acquisitions. We were just finalizing the quarterly market projections on the third floor of the tower yesterday." I sat quietly in the booth, nursing my glass of sparkling water, observing this degrading performance. It was a pathetic display of code switching and corporate desperation. The same woman who demanded I pay a $4,000 dinner bill just to prove I was beneath her was now bending over backward, eagerly begging for a tiny scrap of attention from a man who signed her paychecks. She worshipped proximity to power, completely unaware that true power never has to introduce itself so loudly or so desperately. She was so convinced of her own superiority within our family dynamic, yet here she was fully willing to humiliate herself just to be acknowledged by a white billionaire in a steakhouse. Chloe held her hand out, her artificial smile stretched so tight it looked painful. She waited for him to stop. She waited for the validation she believed her title entitled her to receive. But Richard Sterling did not stop walking. He did not slow down. He did not extend his hand to meet hers, nor did he offer even a polite nod of acknowledgement. He brushed past her outstretched arm, as if she were nothing more than an invisible obstacle in the aisle. He was actively looking for someone. His sharp blue eyes sweeping over the crowded dining room, dismissing tables of wealthy patrons one by one. His gaze moved past the politicians in the corner, past the local celebrities by the bar, and past my sister standing awkwardly in the middle of the floor, with her hand hanging in the empty air. His eyes scanned the room with a frantic intensity until they finally locked directly onto mine. The moment Richard Sterling locked eyes with me, the chaotic energy of the restaurant seemed to completely evaporate. He did not merely walk past my sister. He moved through her personal space as if she were completely invisible, brushing his tailored shoulder against her outstretched arm without a single ounce of hesitation. Chloe was left standing in the middle of the aisle, her perfectly manicured hand hovering awkwardly in the empty space between them. I watched the artificial, overly enthusiastic smile on her face crack and begin to visibly twitch. Her brain was violently rejecting the reality unfolding in front of her. In her carefully constructed universe, she was the brilliant corporate executive, and I was the embarrassing younger sister who worked a menial labor job. The idea that the most powerful man in her industry would completely ignore her existence while making a beeline for my table was an absolute impossibility. Richard stopped directly at the edge of our semicircular booth. He did not spare a single glance for Julian, who was practically choking on his expensive scotch. He did not look at my mother, who sat frozen with her mouth slightly open, entirely stripped of her usual condescending composure. Richard looked only at me. The stern, intimidating glare that terrified boardrooms across the country melted away, instantly replaced by a look of profound, undeniable relief. Emma, he breathed out his voice, carrying clearly over the hushed whispers of the surrounding tables. There you are. My board has been trying to reach you all week. The sheer delicious irony of those words hanging in the air was a sweeter reward than any amount of money could ever buy. Just moments ago, my family had been loudly mocking my career, laughing at the idea that I fixed toasters and cracked phone screens for a living. They had demanded I pay a $4,000 dinner bill as punishment for my supposed financial illiteracy. And now the very billionaire whose approval my sister based her entire self-worth upon was standing at my table looking at me not as an employee, but as an absolute necessity to his survival. I remained perfectly still in the plush leather booth. I did not immediately jump up to shake his hand, nor did I act starstruck. I maintained the exact same calm, composed posture I had held while paying the dinner bill. I am a woman who knows the exact value of my time and my expertise. When you build the kind of proprietary hardware and cybersecurity protocols that can save a multinational conglomerate from total collapse, you never have to chase power. Power comes directly to you. Good evening, Richard, I replied evenly, offering him a polite but measured nod. I have been intentionally unreachable. My executive assistant informed your team on Tuesday that Apex Data Solutions is currently not taking on any emergency corporate recovery contracts. We are focusing entirely on our government accounts this quarter. Julian made a strange, strangled noise in the back of his throat. His pale eyes were bulging out of his head, darting frantically between Richard and me. The realization was slowly, painfully dawning on him that he had just spent an entire evening mocking the founder of a tech firm that even Richard Sterling was desperate to hire. Beside him, my mother had gone completely pale. She clutched her linen napkins so tightly, her knuckles turned white, her mind desperately trying to process how the daughter she had just labeled a failure was casually rejecting a business meeting with a billionaire. Richard leaned closer to the table, completely unbothered by my dismissal. He placed both of his hands firmly on the polished mahogany surface, a gesture of absolute urgency. Emma, please, he insisted, his tone stripped of all corporate pride. This is not a standard recovery job. We suffered a catastrophic server failure at our main data center 3 days ago. We are locked out of our own encrypted drives. Every single hardware specialist we brought in has told us the exact same thing. They told us that the architecture is too complex and that you are the only person in the entire country who has the specific proprietary tech to bypass the fail-safes without wiping the data completely. The silence at our table was absolute. The word billionaire suddenly felt very small compared to the immense leverage I currently held in that room. Richard Sterling was practically begging me, laying his company's vulnerability bare in the middle of a crowded restaurant. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Chloe finally snap out of her paralyzed state. The humiliation of being ignored had quickly morphed into a frantic, desperate panic. She could not allow this narrative to continue. She could not let me hold the upper hand, especially not in front of the man who controlled her promotion to senior partner. She physically forced her way back to the table, squeezing between Richard and a confused waiter. Her face was flushed an angry, blotchy red, and her corporate smile was now a grotesque, forced grimace. She placed a trembling hand on Richard's arm, trying to physically redirect his attention back to her. "Mr. Sterling," she interrupted, her voice shrill and breathless. "Mr. Sterling, I am so sorry for the confusion. There has obviously been a massive misunderstanding here. You have the wrong person. This is just my sister Emma. She does not own a tech firm. She fixes appliances and works at a repair kiosk. She cannot possibly help you with your servers." Richard Sterling looked down at the hand resting on his tailored sleeve as if a cockroach had just crawled out of the air conditioning vent. He did not gently brush Chloe away. He forcefully ripped his arm back, taking a deliberate step away from her. His piercing blue eyes, which had just been filled with pleading vulnerability, when looking at me hardened into shards of absolute ice as he finally registered my sister's presence. Chloe let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh, desperately trying to play off his visible disgust. "I am serious, Mr. Sterling," she babbled, her voice shaking uncontrollably as she tried to salvage her rapidly deteriorating authority. "This is just my sister. She fixes appliances and mobile phones. You are confusing her with someone else." Richard cut her off cold. His voice was a whip cracking through the heavy, tense air of the dining room. "Do not ever interrupt me when I am speaking to an industry peer." He snapped, his tone laced with a lethal dose of corporate authority. "Your sister does not fix appliances. Your sister is the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Data Solutions. She is the only hardware recovery specialist in the entire country who holds the proprietary keys to unlock the military-grade encrypted servers our firm just crashed. She holds a monopoly on the exact architecture that is currently keeping our entire European trading bloc offline." I let the sheer magnitude of his words hang heavily over the table. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a suffocating, absolute vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of my family's lungs. The magnificent illusion they had spent the last decade meticulously building, the one where I was the pathetic failure, and Chloe was the triumphant savior, shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of their eyes. Across the table, Julian had just taken a desperate gulp of his scotch to steady his nerves. As Richard's words fully registered in his brain, Julian violently choked. The amber liquid went straight down his windpipe. He lurched forward, coughing aggressively into his white linen napkin, his face turning a vibrant, unnatural shade of purple. The arrogant hedge fund manager, who had just mocked my financial literacy, was now hacking up a lung, deeply terrified of the fact that he had spent the evening insulting a woman whose net worth clearly eclipsed his wildest dreams. The titanium obsidian card he had boldly called a fake internet prop just moments ago suddenly made terrifying absolute sense to him. My mother was completely speechless. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life orchestrating family gossip and dictating the social hierarchy of our household, Brenda suddenly had absolutely nothing to say. Her jaw was practically unhinged. She stared at me as if I had suddenly morphed into a complete stranger. Her mind was short-circuiting, utterly incapable of reconciling the daughter she had gleefully thrown out onto the street with the titan of industry currently being worshipped by a billionaire. She looked from me to Richard, and then to Chloe, waiting for anyone to tell her this was an elaborate practical joke. But Chloe could not save her. Chloe looked physically ill. The blood had entirely drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. The horrific realization was sinking in that her entire career, her coveted promotion to senior partner, and her standing within Sterling Corporation now rested entirely in the hands of the sister she had just commanded to pay for her dinner. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. She had been thoroughly, publicly stripped of her power, standing frozen in the middle of the restaurant aisle while the surrounding tables watched her spectacular downfall. I did not lift a single finger to save any of them from their profound embarrassment. I simply sat there in the plush leather booth, radiating a calm, untouchable peace, quietly observing the absolute wreckage of their arrogance. It was a masterclass in divine timing. I could have spent years trying to convince them of my success, showing them corporate bank statements or massive magazine features, and they would have still found a toxic way to minimize it. But hearing it directly from the mouth of the incredibly powerful man they worshipped was an undeniable, inescapable truth they were forced to swallow whole. Their delusions could no longer protect them from my reality. Richard Sterling completely ignored the sputtering mess of my brother-in-law and the horrified paralysis of my mother and sister. He dismissed their existence entirely, turning his broad back on Chloe as if she were nothing more than an unpleasant draft of air. He leaned back in toward our table, placing his palms flat on the mahogany surface, once again his entire focus returning exclusively to me. He took a deep, heavy breath, dropping the hostile executive persona he had just used to obliterate my sister, and adopted the tone of a man facing total corporate ruin, ready to make a desperate plea for his company's survival. I looked at Richard Sterling, observing the deep tension lines around his eyes and the rigid set of his shoulders. Here was a man who commanded tens of thousands of employees and dictated global market trends, reduced to laying his vulnerabilities bare in the middle of a steakhouse. I did not gloat. I did not revel in his desperation the way my sister would have. I simply met his gaze with the calm, measured authority of an equal. "I understand the severity of a compromised European trading bloc, Richard," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "My schedule is incredibly tight this quarter, and taking on an emergency recovery of this magnitude will require pulling my top engineers off existing government contracts. However, I am willing to have my lead architect review your diagnostic reports." Richard let out a heavy breath, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as the immediate threat of corporate annihilation slightly receded. "Thank you, Emma. I cannot overstate how crucial this is. I will have my technical directors forward the encrypted logs immediately. Have your executive team send the files to my office by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," I instructed, slowly sliding out of the plush leather booth. "If my team determines that your server architecture is actually salvageable without corrupting the core data, we will discuss drafting a contract. But be prepared, Richard. Emergency hardware recovery at this scale, especially when bypassing military-grade fail-safes, comes with an unprecedented premium." "Money is absolutely not an issue," Richard replied, instantly extending his hand. He did not offer me the condescending, dismissive handshake he gave his subordinates. He offered a firm, deeply respectful grip, acknowledging me as a peer who held the keys to his kingdom. "Whatever your firm needs, we will authorize it." I gave him a single professional nod. "I will expect the files in the morning. Enjoy the rest of your evening." I picked up my designer handbag and smoothed the front of my dress. I did not look back at Chloe, who was still standing in the aisle, practically hyperventilating as she watched her boss treat me like royalty. I did not look at Julian, who was still wheezing and wiping his watering eyes with a napkin, thoroughly humiliated by his own arrogant assumptions. And I certainly did not look at my mother, whose entire carefully curated worldview had just been violently detonated. I had absolutely nothing left to say to any of them. Silence was a far more devastating weapon than any insult I could have thrown their way. I turned and walked toward the front of the restaurant. The dining room, which had been buzzing with loud conversations and clinking silverware when I first arrived, was now noticeably subdued. The surrounding patrons had watched the entire power dynamic shift, and they parted slightly as I made my way down the center aisle. The maitre d', who had witnessed the black titanium card drop earlier, rushed ahead to hold the heavy glass doors open for me, bowing his head respectfully as I passed. Stepping out of the restaurant was like crossing a physical boundary between my past and my present. The cool, crisp Atlanta night air hit my skin instantly, washing away the stifling, toxic atmosphere of the dinner table. The heavy scent of roasted meats and expensive perfumes was replaced by the clean, sharp smell of the city after dusk. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet air of absolute freedom. There was a profound, radiating heat blooming in my chest. It was the heat of victory, but not the petty, vindictive kind my sister constantly chased. It was the deep, unshakable satisfaction of knowing I had built a fortress of success, so undeniable that their attempts to tear me down had simply shattered against the walls. I had not needed to raise my voice. I had not needed to defend my humanity. I had simply let my reality speak for itself, and the truth had completely crushed them. My private chauffeur, Thomas, saw me exit the building and immediately pulled the sleek black SUV up to the curb, the tires gliding silently to a halt. He stepped out from the driver's side, his dark suit immaculate, and moved quickly to open the heavy rear passenger door for me. "Good evening, Ms. Wilson," Thomas said warmly, offering a professional smile. "I hope the dinner was satisfactory." "It was incredibly revealing, Thomas," I replied, offering him a genuine smile in return. "Please take me home. I have an early morning tomorrow." I was just about to step up into the luxurious leather interior of the vehicle when I felt a sharp, aggressive vibration in my coat pocket. The sudden buzz was jarring against the quiet peace of the evening. I paused, resting my hand on the doorframe, and pulled my phone out. The bright screen illuminated the darkness, displaying a new text message. It was from my mother. Even after witnessing the undeniable proof of my success, even after seeing her golden child publicly stripped of her power, my mother could not surrender her delusions. She could not fathom a world where I was not a resource to be exploited for Chloe's benefit. Instead of apologizing for the horrific way they had treated me, her desperate need to control the narrative forced her to double down. I stared at the glowing words on the screen, feeling a cold, clinical detachment wash over me. The message read, "How dare you humiliate your sister in front of her boss like that? You are completely out of control. You will get her that contract tomorrow and make sure she gets the credit for it, or you are dead to me." I read the threat twice, the sheer audacity of her entitlement almost comical. I did not type a response. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection that used to haunt my childhood. I simply locked the screen, slid the phone back into my pocket, and climbed into the car. They wanted a war over this contract. Tomorrow morning I was going to give them a corporate execution. The sun rose over Atlanta, casting a brilliant glare against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Apex Data Solutions corporate headquarters. I arrived at my office at 6 in the morning, long before the city had fully woken up. My compound was a sprawling state-of-the-art facility right in the heart of Midtown. It featured biometric security checkpoints, a private server farm housed behind blast-proof glass, and 3 floors of the sharpest engineering minds in the entire country. It was a far cry from the dingy mall kiosk my family had spent years joking about. I sat behind my massive custom-tempered glass desk, sipping my morning espresso and reviewing the encrypted server logs Richard Sterling had desperately sent over at the crack of dawn. The data was an absolute disaster, entirely corrupted by a vicious ransomware protocol, but it was completely salvageable for someone with my specific skill set. I held his company's life support in the palm of my hands. At precisely 9:15, my office intercom buzzed. It was my executive assistant, Marcus. His usually calm and measured voice carried a distinct note of alarm. "Ms. Wilson," he said, "there is a situation in the main lobby. 3 individuals are demanding to see you. They do not have appointments, they bypassed the visitor screening protocol, and they are currently threatening to call the police on our security team if they are not allowed upstairs immediately. The older woman is loudly claiming she is your mother and that she practically owns this building." I did not panic. I did not feel the old familiar anxiety that usually accompanied my family's chaotic outbursts. I simply smiled, staring at the flashing code on my monitors. "Send them up, Marcus," I replied smoothly, "and have security escort them directly to my executive suite." 2 minutes later, the heavy frosted glass doors to my office slid open. In walked Chloe, Julian, and my mother. The aggressive, righteous fury they had undoubtedly planned to unleash during their elevator ride completely evaporated the second they stepped into my workspace. I watched from my chair as their eyes darted wildly around the massive room. They took in the panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline, the multi-million-dollar modern art pieces hanging on the walls, and the massive digital command center displaying real-time global data feeds from my international clients. As they were escorted through the main engineering bay, just moments prior, they had been forced to walk past dozens of brilliant developers and security experts, all working under my roof and on my payroll. The sheer scale of my wealth and corporate power hit them like a physical blow. Julian looked physically ill. The arrogant hedge fund manager, who prided himself on recognizing valuable assets, realized he was standing in a room worth more than his entire professional portfolio. He stared at the sleek minimalist architecture, his pale face draining of what little color it had left. He nervously adjusted his expensive silk tie, his usual swagger completely replaced by the frantic energy of a man who suddenly realized he was the poorest and least influential person in the room. My mother Brenda was gripping her designer handbag so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. She looked at the imported Italian leather visitor sofas and the flawless marble floors, her mind clearly short-circuiting. She had spent a lifetime treating me like a peasant, actively suppressing my potential just to keep her favorite daughter comfortable. I could literally see the wheels turning in her head. I could see the exact moment she stopped viewing me as a massive disappointment and immediately started viewing me as an untapped, limitless bank account. A normal family, upon realizing they had spent a decade violently underestimating their own flesh and blood, might have felt profound shame. They might have offered a sincere apology for the horrific way they had treated me at the steakhouse just 12 hours prior. They might have acknowledged my hard work, my brilliance, or simply the undeniable reality of my success. But my family did not operate on logic, love, or basic human decency. Their fragile egos could not process shame, so they immediately converted their deep embarrassment into pure, weaponized entitlement. They convinced themselves that because we shared the same last name, my empire somehow belonged to them. Chloe was vibrating with a toxic mixture of intense jealousy and sheer unadulterated panic. Her prestigious job, her highly coveted promotion to senior partner, and her entire carefully crafted corporate identity were hanging by a thread, and I was the one holding the scissors. She stomped across the vast expanse of my office, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She bypassed the plush visitor chairs, entirely refusing to sit down and be treated like a regular guest in my domain. She desperately needed to assert dominance. She needed to drag me back down to her level to feel safe again. She marched directly up to my desk, her face twisted into an ugly, demanding scowl. She did not say good morning. She did not ask how I was doing. She leaned forward, placed both of her hands flat on the pristine surface of my glass desk, and slammed them down with a loud, aggressive crack. The sharp sound echoed through the cavernous space of my executive suite, but I did not even blink. I simply took another slow sip of my espresso, my eyes tracing the invisible smudge her sweaty palms had just left on my pristine glass desktop. "You are going to give me that contract," Chloe demanded, her voice vibrating with a frantic, desperate pitch. She leaned closer, her perfect posture crumbling into an aggressive hunch. "I spoke to Richard's technical directors this morning. They said you quoted them an initial base rate of $10 million for the emergency recovery. You are going to draft the paperwork and funnel that entire contract directly through my acquisitions department by noon today." I raised an eyebrow, letting the sheer absurdity of her command wash over me. She was not asking for a favor. She was issuing a directive, fully expecting me to hand over a massive corporate deal just so she could attach her name to my labor. "And why exactly would I do that, Chloe?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than a multi-million-dollar corporate ransom. "Because if I bring in the Apex contract, Richard will immediately fast-track my promotion to senior partner," Chloe snapped, as if this explanation somehow justified her absolute delusion. "My division is down this quarter. Julian's hedge fund took a massive hit, and we need this promotion to finalize the mortgage on our new estate in Buckhead. You owe me this, Emma. You have more than enough money here. It is time you finally contribute something meaningful to this family." The audacity was so profound it was almost breathtaking. I looked past her and locked eyes with Julian. He had the nerve to nod in agreement, attempting to summon a shred of his usual Wall Street arrogance to back up his wife. "It is just standard business synergy," Emma, Julian chimed in, stepping up beside Chloe and desperately trying to sound like the smartest man in the room. "You get the financial payout, Chloe gets the corporate credit, and everyone wins. It keeps the wealth and the power within the family. It is exactly how the elite operate. You should be thanking us for guiding you through high-level corporate structuring." I placed my espresso cup down on its ceramic saucer with a soft, deliberate clink. The absolute mental gymnastics required for them to stand in my headquarters and demand a $10 million favor was staggering. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, interlacing my fingers and resting them on my lap. "Let me make sure I am fully understanding this elite business synergy," I said, my voice dripping with surgical precision. Less than 12 hours ago, the three of you sat in a public restaurant and loudly mocked my entire existence. You called me a toaster repair girl. You joked about me working at a mall kiosk. You demanded I pay a $4,000 dinner bill as a punishment for my supposed financial illiteracy, specifically to humiliate me. And now you are standing in the middle of my tech empire demanding I hand you the biggest corporate rescue contract of the year so you can buy a new mansion. Chloe's face flushed a deep blotchy crimson. That was different, she stammered frantically, trying to rewrite history in real time. We did not know about all of this. We thought you were struggling. We were just trying to motivate you to do better. We were pushing you because we care. You were trying to break me, I corrected her, my voice dropping an octave, slicing through her pathetic excuse like a scalpel. You have spent your entire life trying to break me because my independence threatens your fragile ego. You do not want my help, Chloe. You want my submission. You want to take my $10 million contract, slap your name on it, and parade it around your boardroom so you can pretend you are the genius savior of Sterling Corporation. You want to wear my success as your costume because you produce absolutely nothing of value yourself. How dare you speak to your sister that way? My mother suddenly erupted, finally finding her voice. Brenda marched to the front of the desk, physically inserting herself between Chloe and me. Her eyes were blazing with that familiar righteous indignation she always used to protect her golden child. She is your blood. Brenda practically spit the words at me. Family protects family. Chloe is on the verge of a massive career milestone, and you are sitting here hoarding your resources like a selfish, ungrateful child. I raised you to support your sister. After everything we have done for you, you are going to draft that contract today, or so help me God. I will make sure you regret it. Everything you have done for me, I repeated, letting out a short, hollow laugh. You mean kicking me out of the house when I refused to pay for Chloe's Ivy League tuition? You mean ignoring my business for a decade? You mean letting your son-in-law humiliate me in public while you drank your expensive wine? That is a very interesting definition of family protection, Mother. But let me be absolutely clear. The answer is no. Apex Data Solutions will sign directly with Richard Sterling. Chloe will not receive a single drop of credit for my architecture. Her name will not be anywhere near my paperwork. Chloe let out a strangled gasp, stepping back as if I had physically struck her. She looked at our mother, her eyes wide with a frantic, pleading panic. She knew that without this contract, her career at Sterling Corporation was effectively over. Richard would never forgive her for humiliating the one person who could save his servers. Brenda saw the sheer terror in her favorite daughter's eyes, and something dark and vicious settled over her features. The mask of the respectable church-going matriarch completely melted away, leaving only the cold, calculating manipulator beneath. She squared her shoulders, staring down at me with a look of absolute disgust. She was ready to play the ultimate trump card, the one weapon she believed gave her absolute power over my life. Fine, Brenda hissed, her voice dropping to a lethal, venomous whisper. If you want to play hardball. Emma, we will play hardball. You either sign that contract over to Chloe's department right now, or I am calling my lawyers the second I leave this building. I will cut you out of the family trust entirely. You will not see a single penny of your father's estate, the summer house, or the investment portfolios. I will leave you with absolutely nothing. For a brief second, after my mother delivered her ultimate threat, the room was completely silent. She stood there with her chin held high, her chest puffed out with the absolute certainty that she had just backed me into an inescapable corner. She truly believed that the promise of generational wealth was the leash she could use to drag me back into submission. I looked at her, then looked at the two people cowering slightly behind her, and I could not help myself. I started to laugh. It was not a bitter, defensive laugh. It was a genuine, echoing laugh that bubbled up from the very bottom of my chest. It filled the expansive executive suite, bouncing off the glass walls and the pristine marble floors. My mother's triumphant expression immediately faltered, replaced by a look of deep, uncomfortable confusion. She had expected tears. She had expected me to beg for forgiveness and frantically draft the contract for my sister just to stay in her good graces. My laughter was completely off her script. "Are you losing your mind?" Brenda demanded, her voice wavering slightly as her confidence began to crack. "I am talking about millions of dollars, Emma. I am talking about your entire future. This is not a joke." "Oh, mother," I replied, wiping a small tear of genuine amusement from the corner of my eye. "It is the biggest joke of the century. The only problem is that you are the only person in this room who does not know the punchline yet." I turned my attention away from her and reached for my wireless keyboard. My fingers flew across the keys, bypassing 2 layers of biometric security to access my encrypted personal server. As the chief executive officer of a data recovery firm, information was my primary currency. I made it my absolute business to know everything about the people who tried to destroy me. I opened a highly classified financial dossier I had compiled months ago, maximizing the document on my massive curved display. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I grabbed the edge of the monitor and spun it completely around so the bright screen faced my family. "Take a very close look at that screen, Mother," I instructed, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "Because that is the family trust you are currently threatening me with." Brenda stepped closer to the desk, her eyes squinting to read the complex spreadsheets, wire transfer logs, and bank statements glowing on the monitor. At first, she just looked confused. The financial jargon and corporate routing numbers did not make sense to her. But then her eyes caught the bold red text at the bottom of the master ledger. The current available balance of the Wilson Family Trust was listed at exactly $412. "What is this?" Brenda whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is a mistake. The trust has over $8 million in liquid assets. The summer house alone is worth $2 million. This is a fake document you created to trick me." I shook my head slowly, feeling a cold, clinical satisfaction as I prepared to dismantle her reality completely. "Those are official bank records, directly from the Cayman account's mother. The $8 million you thought you had for your retirement has been gone for over 2 years. The summer house was leveraged with a second mortgage that went into default 6 months ago. The family trust is completely empty." Brenda physically stumbled back, bumping into one of the Italian leather visitor chairs. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. But how she choked out, "Your father set that money up in a locked portfolio. It was untouchable." "It was untouchable to me," I corrected her sharply. "But it was completely accessible to the person you gave power of attorney to when Dad passed away." I tapped my manicured finger against the glass desk, pointing directly at my brother-in-law. "You gave the keys to the castle to the brilliant Wall Street hedge fund manager because you were so obsessed with having a wealthy, respectable white son-in-law." All 3 of them froze. Chloe let out a small, pathetic whimper, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Julian looked as if he had just been struck by a physical blow. The arrogant smirk he had worn since the restaurant was entirely gone, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated panic of a cornered animal. I slowly walked them through the paper trail displayed on the screen, detailing every single illicit transaction with merciless precision. 2 years ago, Julian took a massive risk on a highly volatile cryptocurrency venture. When the market crashed, his hedge fund was completely exposed. Instead of admitting his failure to his investors, he quietly siphoned the entire Wilson family trust to cover his margin calls. He drained your retirement accounts, Mother. He leveraged the summer house. He stole every single penny my father worked his entire life to save, and he lost it all in less than 48 hours. Brenda turned her head slowly, looking at Julian as if she were seeing a monster wearing human skin. Julian held his hands up defensively, stepping away from her. "Brenda, listen to me," he stammered, his voice cracking with desperation. "It was a temporary liquidity issue. The market was unpredictable. I was going to put it all back as soon as my next fund cleared. I swear to you, I had a plan to replace every dime, and you knew about this?" Brenda asked, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper as she turned to look at her golden child. Chloe burst into tears, her perfect corporate facade completely disintegrating. "Mom, please, we were going to fix it," she sobbed, reaching out for her mother. "We just needed time. If Richard promotes me to senior partner, the signing bonus will cover the second mortgage. That is why we need Emma to give me the contract today. We are trying to save the family." The devastation on my mother's face was absolute. The psychological collapse of her entire worldview happened right in front of my eyes. The daughter she had worshipped, the golden child, who could do no wrong, had actively conspired with her husband to steal her mother's life savings, and then covered it up. The perfect, respectable life Brenda had spent decades bragging about to her country club friends was a complete mirage built on a foundation of theft and lies. She had thrown me out onto the street to protect these people, and they had rewarded her by picking her pockets clean. "You threatened to leave me with absolutely nothing, Mother," I said softly, the absolute finality of my words ringing through the room. "But you cannot take away what you no longer possess. You are completely bankrupt. The only person in this room who holds any actual wealth, any actual power, and any actual future is the daughter you told to go fix toasters." The humiliation was too much for Julian to bear. His fragile ego, built entirely on unearned privilege and stolen money, violently shattered. His pale face flushed a deep, furious crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. He let out an animalistic sound of pure rage, balled his hands into tight fists, and stepped aggressively toward me. I watched Julian take that aggressive step toward me, his hands balled into tight fists, his face contorted with the kind of reckless fury that only comes from a mediocre man whose entire facade has just been violently ripped away. For a split second, he genuinely believed he could physically intimidate me in my own headquarters. He believed that his anger, his white privilege, and his sudden panic were somehow more valid and more threatening than the multi-million-dollar corporate fortress I had built around myself. But I did not shrink back into my chair. I did not break eye contact. I simply shifted my weight, reached under the thick edge of my tempered glass desk, and pressed my finger firmly against the silent biometric security button mounted hidden out of sight. Julian stopped inches from the edge of my desk, his chest heaving as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Emma?" He spat, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet suite. "You think you understand how global finance works because you build computer servers. You know absolutely nothing about the pressure I am under or the high-level deals I manage. You are going to draft that contract over to Chloe today, or I swear to God I will tear this entire place apart and make sure Richard Sterling knows exactly how uncooperative you are." He never got the chance to finish his pathetic, desperate tantrum. Less than 10 seconds after my finger grazed the panic button, the heavy frosted glass doors of my executive suite slid open with a sharp, mechanical hiss. My executive assistant Marcus stepped into the room, his expression completely blank, holding an electronic tablet. Right behind him were 3 members of my private security detail. These were not standard office building security guards. They were highly trained former military contractors who oversaw the physical security of our classified military-grade data centers. They moved with absolute terrifying efficiency. They did not ask what the problem was or politely inquire about the shouting. They simply moved into the room and smoothly flanked my family, forming a solid, muscular wall between my desk and my brother-in-law. "It is time for you to leave the premises," Marcus stated smoothly, his voice devoid of any emotion or hesitation. He gestured toward the open doors. "Please proceed to the elevator bank immediately." Julian took one look at the sheer size of the security personnel, and the remaining bravado instantly drained from his body. He took a rapid step backward, nearly tripping over his own expensive leather shoes, suddenly remembering that he was not the one in control of this environment. My mother, however, could not comprehend the sudden shift in authority. She was so entirely used to being the undisputed matriarch that the sight of armed men ordering her out of a room simply did not compute in her brain. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking as she turned her misplaced fury onto Marcus. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am her mother. I practically own this building. Tell these hired thugs to back off right now, Emma. Tell them to leave us alone. I picked up my espresso cup, taking a slow, calming sip before setting it down. They do not work for you, mother, I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical screaming with icy precision. And as you have just seen on those bank ledgers, you do not own absolutely anything anymore. Escort them out, Marcus. If they resist in any way, call the Atlanta Police Department and press formal trespassing charges. The lead security officer stepped forward, placing a massive, unyielding hand firmly on Julian's shoulder. That was the exact moment the reality of their situation finally crushed them. There was no more room for manipulation. There were no more family guilt trips to leverage. They had absolutely zero power in my domain. They were forcefully marched out of my executive suite. I stood up from my desk and slowly followed them to the doorway, leaning against the glass frame to watch the procession. It was a profound, deeply cathartic experience to witness the physical removal of the toxicity that had poisoned my life for 3.5 decades. For years, my childhood bedroom had felt like a prison cell, while they paraded around demanding perfection and constantly moving the goalposts. Now I was watching them being forcefully ejected from the sanctuary I had built with my own 2 hands. My security detail guided them through the main engineering bay. The dozens of brilliant developers, software architects, and data analysts who worked for me had paused their typing. They watched in absolute stunned silence as Chloe, the woman who worshipped corporate status more than her own soul, was paraded through a real corporate headquarters like a common criminal. Her face was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she sobbed, completely humiliated in front of my elite staff. Brenda stumbled along beside her, her perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled looking, entirely lost in a world she could no longer manipulate or control with her biting words. They finally reached the private executive elevator bank at the end of the long corridor. Marcus swiped his master keycard, and the polished steel doors slid open instantly. The security guards corralled all 3 of them into the confined space, effectively treating them like hostile intruders. Just before the doors could slide shut, Julian turned around to face me down the length of the hallway. His eyes were wide with a frantic, cornered desperation. He had lost his stolen money, he had lost his dignity, and he was dangerously close to losing his freedom. But his immense privilege absolutely refused to let him accept defeat gracefully. He needed to fire one last desperate shot to protect his fragile, crumbling ego. He grabbed the edge of the elevator door, physically stopping it from closing. He glared at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure venom. "You think you have won because you have a fancy office and a few security guards?" Julian snarled, his voice echoing aggressively down the pristine marble corridor. "You are completely out of your league, Emma. I know the most powerful venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. I have white shoe legal teams on retainer who destroy companies like yours for sport. I will file so many injunctions against your little tech startup that you will not even be able to function. I will make sure your company is tied up in litigation until you bleed out and beg me to stop." I stared down the hallway at him, completely unbothered by the empty threats of a bankrupt thief who was entirely dependent on my architecture to survive. Marcus stepped forward, his expression hardening, and firmly shoved Julian's hand off the elevator door. The polished steel panels slid shut with a heavy final clank, completely severing my toxic family from my sanctuary and leaving me in absolute peace. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing away the chaotic noise of my family and leaving my executive suite in a state of absolute pristine quiet. I did not waste a single second dwelling on Julian and his desperate parting threat. I had a multi-million-dollar corporate rescue mission to execute. Richard Sterling had delivered the encrypted server logs exactly as promised, and my top engineers had spent the entire morning running diagnostic protocols. The ransomware attacking his European trading bloc was vicious, but it was not invincible. By 11:30, My team had confirmed that our proprietary hardware architecture could successfully bypass the military-grade fail-safes without corrupting the core financial data. I held the survival of Sterling Corporation entirely in my hands, but Julian was a man whose fragile ego had just been publicly shattered, and mediocre men with deep pockets are dangerously predictable. He made good on his threat faster than I had anticipated. At exactly 12:15, my executive assistant Marcus walked into my office carrying a massive stack of legal documents bound in heavy cardstock. A process server had just dropped them off at the front security desk. I took the thick manila folder, feeling the physical weight of Julian's retaliation. The cover page bore the letterhead of one of the most ruthless, expensive white shoe law firms in downtown Atlanta. They were notorious for representing hedge funds and corporate conglomerates, a firm that charged $1,000 an hour specifically to bury smaller businesses in endless, suffocating paperwork. I scanned the emergency filing. Julian had leveraged his high-powered legal connections to fast-track a frivolous injunction against Apex Data Solutions. The lawsuit claimed that my proprietary hardware architecture, the exact same technology Richard Sterling was begging me to use, infringed on a broad, vaguely worded patent held by an obscure shell company registered in Delaware. A shell company that Julian just so happened to control as the managing director. It was a calculated precision strike designed to immediately freeze my contract negotiations with Sterling Corporation. Julian did not actually believe he could win a patent infringement case in federal court. He knew perfectly well that I had developed my technology from the ground up and held airtight intellectual property rights. But winning was never his objective. He only needed to create enough legal liability, bureaucratic delay, and public doubt to make Richard Sterling walk away. Billionaires do not sign massive recovery contracts with tech firms entangled in active intellectual property disputes. Julian was weaponizing the American legal system as a blunt instrument to starve me out fully, intending to drag my company into a brutal years-long war of attrition. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, staring at the towering stack of legal threats on my desk. I felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion wash over me. It was not fear, and it was not panic. It was the specific heavy exhaustion known only to Black women who have spent their entire lives building empires from scratch, only to be constantly attacked by men who inherited their power. Julian had never written a single line of code in his life. He had never built a server network, negotiated a legitimate vendor contract, or created a single product of actual value to society. His entire existence was predicated on moving invisible money around and using his systemic privilege to bully people into submission. He assumed that because he had access to old money and prestigious lawyers, he automatically held the upper hand. He expected me to react the way his previous victims had reacted. He wanted me to panic, to cry, and to feel the crushing weight of his unearned authority. He expected me to immediately dial my corporate legal counsel, burning through hundreds of thousands of dollars in retainer fees just to defend my own life's work. He wanted me to beg him to drop the injunction, to offer him a massive financial settlement, or better yet, to surrender the Sterling contract entirely to my sister, just to make the legal nightmare disappear. He thought he could use his systemic privilege to force my compliance, confident that his financial endurance would eventually outlast my resolve. But Julian fundamentally misunderstood the landscape of the battlefield he had just stepped onto. He thought we were playing a traditional game of corporate intimidation, relying on paper threats, court dates, and expensive lawyers in tailored suits. He forgot that we were fighting in the digital realm, a world that I had personally designed, built, and mastered. I was the architect of the very systems his entire industry relied upon to function. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I did not reach for my desk phone to call my lead attorney. I did not draft a frantic email to my board of directors, and I certainly did not entertain the idea of surrendering my contract. I simply pushed the thick stack of expensive legal documents to the far edge of my glass desk, letting them sit there like a pile of useless trash. I turned my attention away from his paper threats and focused entirely on my massive curved monitor. I cracked my knuckles, taking a slow, deep breath of the cool, climate-controlled air circulating through my executive suite. I bypassed my standard desktop interface, entered my highest-level encrypted credentials, and opened my master terminal network. The master terminal network illuminated my face with a cool blue glow as lines of encrypted code began to cascade down the massive curved display. Julian lived in a world of country clubs, expensive steak dinners, and paper lawsuits. He fundamentally believed that power was something you inherited, something you wielded loudly through aggressive lawyers and frivolous court filings. But I lived in the architecture of the modern world. I understood that true power was completely silent. It was the invisible digital infrastructure that governed every single financial transaction on the planet. Julian was trying to evict me from a house that I had personally designed, built, and locked. I started by running a trace on the obscure Delaware shell company he had listed in the injunction. On paper, it was a ghost entity shielded by layers of corporate anonymity and high-priced legal rhetoric designed to stall any traditional investigation. But digital footprints always exist if you know exactly where to look. I bypassed the public registry and tapped directly into the financial routing protocols. It took me less than 4 minutes to track the IP addresses associated with the shell company's recent patent filings. The digital trail led directly back to the primary server farm of Julian's hedge fund, right here in Atlanta. I leaned forward, my fingers moving across the keyboard with a rhythmic practice speed. Now that I was inside the outer layer of his corporate network, I decided to take a very close look at the technology stack his hedge fund was currently operating on. High-frequency trading firms like his relied entirely on automated quantitative algorithms. They needed zero-latency data transfers to execute millions of micro-trades per second. To do that safely, they required military-grade cybersecurity to prevent their proprietary trading models from being intercepted by rival firms. I pulled up the security protocols his IT department had installed across his entire global network. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. Julian's massive, intimidating hedge fund was completely secured by the Apex Sentinel protocol. It was a proprietary enterprise architecture that I had personally coded from scratch 5 years ago. I licensed it out through a network of third-party corporate vendors, which meant Julian's chief technology officer had purchased it entirely off the shelf because it was widely recognized as the best security protocol in the world. Julian had absolutely no idea that the woman he so desperately loved to mock as a toaster repair girl was the sole architect of the very walls protecting his entire financial empire. He took the safety of his wealth completely for granted, unaware that I held the master key to his kingdom. I did not need to hire an expensive white shoe law firm to fight his frivolous injunction. I did not need to beg a judge for a dismissal. I simply opened the standard enterprise licensing agreement for the Apex Sentinel protocol. I scrolled down to Section 4, Paragraph B. The clause explicitly stated that any corporate entity engaging in hostile litigation, intellectual property theft, or fraudulent legal claims against Apex Data Solutions or its subsidiaries immediately and permanently forfeited their licensing rights. Julian had tried to weaponize the American legal system against me, but he had failed to read the terms of service. I opened the central command console for my global licensing division. I located the active enterprise key assigned to his hedge fund. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or hesitation. Julian had brought this execution entirely upon himself. He had mocked my labor, stolen my mother's retirement, conspired with my sister to ruin my reputation, and then tried to legally suffocate my company. It was time for him to understand exactly what happens when you disrespect the architect of your reality. I typed the command sequence to initiate a total license revocation. A small confirmation window popped up on my screen, asking if I was absolutely certain I wanted to terminate the connection. I stared at the prompt for a brief second, feeling the immense quiet power of the digital realm. With a single decisive strike of the Enter key, I executed the command. The devastation was instantaneous and completely silent. I watched the live data stream as the encrypted tunnels protecting Julian's high-frequency trading algorithms instantly collapsed. The Apex Sentinel protocol evaporated from his servers like smoke. Without that critical security architecture in place, his automated trading systems performed exactly as they were programmed to do in the event of a catastrophic security breach. They executed an immediate emergency freeze to prevent data leaks. In a fraction of a second, his entire global operation went completely dark. Millions of dollars in active leveraging trades were suddenly suspended in digital purgatory. The algorithms that generated his massive wealth were violently halted mid-execution. The market was currently experiencing a massive midday swing, and Julian's fund was now entirely blind, unable to buy, sell, or even monitor their incredibly exposed positions. He was hemorrhaging money by the second, and there was absolutely nothing his expensive lawyers or his country club connections could do to stop it. He had tried to bury me in paperwork, so I had effectively turned his entire company off. The absolute silence of my executive suite was suddenly broken by a sharp, aggressive vibration. My cell phone danced across the surface of my glass desk. I did not rush to pick it up. I let it ring, watching the screen illuminate with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed Julian's private cell phone number. I slowly reached out and picked up the device, swiping the screen to accept the call. I brought the phone to my ear but did not say a single word. Through the speaker, I could hear a symphony of absolute chaos. Sirens were blaring in the background of his trading floor. People were screaming in a state of sheer panic. Emma Julian shrieked, his voice cracking with a terrifying, breathless hysteria. "Emma, what did you just do? My entire network is completely down. We are dropping millions. We are completely exposed. Emma, you have to turn it back on right now." "I will drop the injunction. I will drop everything. Please, you are destroying me." I listened to his desperate, hyperventilating pleas for exactly 3 seconds. I absorbed the sweet sound of his unearned arrogance shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Then, without uttering a single syllable in response, I pressed the red button and hung up the phone. I set the phone down on my glass desk and took a deep breath. The silence in my office was profound and deeply satisfying. I had just dismantled Julian's entire financial empire with a single keystroke. His frivolous lawsuit was nothing more than a paper shield against a digital execution. But as satisfying as it was to hear him beg, I knew my family dynamic far too well to believe the war was truly over. Julian had failed completely. That meant the immense suffocating pressure of Richard Sterling's impending deadline now rested entirely on Chloe's shoulders. By 5 o'clock that evening, the corporate rumor mill was already spinning out of control. My industry contacts informed me that Richard was furious and growing increasingly impatient. He had given Chloe a strict ultimatum. She had to deliver the recovered data by tomorrow morning, or she could pack up her desk and consider her career at Sterling Corporation permanently terminated. Chloe's entire identity was wrapped up in her prestigious title as Vice President of Acquisitions. Her self-worth, her marriage to a now bankrupt hedge fund manager, and her status as our mother's flawless golden child all depended on a paycheck that was about to disappear. She had no leverage left. She had no money to buy me out, and no legal threats to force my hand. When a narcissist is pushed into a corner and stripped of their power, they do not surrender gracefully. They cross lines they previously thought were unimaginable. This was the exact moment my sister transitioned from engaging in petty corporate warfare to committing literal felony espionage. I knew exactly how she planned to do it. During their ambush in my executive suite that morning, when Chloe had violently slammed her hands down on my glass desk, she had knocked over a stack of visitor files. In the ensuing chaos of being physically escorted out by my security team, her desperate, grasping hands had managed to swipe a temporary access badge left behind by an independent contractor. It was a lower-level keycard, but it possessed just enough clearance to get through the external lobby doors and into the secondary server bays. She thought she had pulled off a brilliant and stealthy act of thievery. She did not realize that every single badge in my building was tracked by a centralized biometric grid, and I had been fully aware of the missing card the second she stepped onto the elevator. The shift into sheer criminality happened shortly after midnight. The sprawling Apex Data Solutions compound was completely dark from the outside, blending into the quiet shadows of the midtown Atlanta streets. Inside, the massive cooling fans hummed a steady rhythmic drone, keeping the towering racks of blinking servers at an optimal temperature. Chloe was not a trained corporate spy. She was a desperate executive wearing dark athletic clothing she had probably purchased at a high-end boutique specifically for this ridiculous occasion. She approached the side entrance of my facility, her hands trembling violently in the cool night air as she held the stolen access badge up to the digital scanner. A small green light flashed on the security panel, and the heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a soft mechanical click. Chloe slipped inside the building, her heart pounding aggressively against her ribs. She was risking federal prison time just to maintain the illusion that she was inherently better than me. She crept through the dimly lit engineering bay, frantically searching for the primary server room. She foolishly believed that the decrypted Sterling data was just sitting on a physical hard drive, waiting for her to grab it and present it to Richard the next morning, like a triumphant hero. She was driven purely by the blinding, toxic need to steal my victory and claim it as her own. She navigated the maze of glass walls and computer terminals, entirely unaware that the building was equipped with motion-tracking infrared cameras covering every single square inch of the floor plan. She moved deeper into the facility, her breathing shallow and ragged. The pristine corporate environment she usually commanded had been replaced by a cold, intimidating digital fortress that I had built from the ground up. She was a trespasser in my world now. Every step she took was recorded, categorized, and uploaded to my secure cloud network. She was so consumed by her own arrogance and desperation that she never stopped to consider why a tech firm specializing in military-grade data recovery would leave a side door accessible with a simple contractor badge. I had left the door unlocked for her intentionally. I needed her to fully commit to her own destruction. Several miles away, I was relaxing in my luxury penthouse overlooking the glittering city skyline. I had changed into comfortable silk pajamas and was sitting on my plush velvet sofa, enjoying a hot cup of chamomile tea. The day had been long, and I was savoring the quiet peace of my sanctuary. I watched the headlights of cars moving silently along the highway far below, feeling entirely detached from the chaos my family was currently experiencing. Just as I took a soothing sip from my porcelain cup, a sharp, distinct chime cut through the quiet atmosphere of my living room. I reached for my phone resting on the polished marble coffee table. The screen glowed brightly in the dim light, displaying a high-priority security alert transmitted directly from my headquarters. It was a silent alarm. The notification boldly stated that an unauthorized user was currently attempting to breach the secondary server bay. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. My trap had just snapped shut. I placed my porcelain teacup back onto the marble saucer with a soft clink. I did not feel a sudden rush of adrenaline or the frantic panic of a business owner under attack. I felt the cold, calculated calm of a spider watching a fly land directly in the center of its web. I picked up my tablet from the coffee table and opened the Apex proprietary security application. After passing the biometric scan, the screen illuminated with a grid of live 4K video feeds from every corner of my facility. I tapped on the camera covering the secondary server bay, expanding the video to fill the entire screen. The high-definition night vision rendered the dark room in crisp, glowing detail. There was Chloe. She was creeping down the center aisle of the server racks wearing a black designer track jacket and dark leggings, looking like a ridiculously overdressed burglar from a bad espionage movie. Her head darted back and forth, her eyes wide with paranoid terror. She was completely out of her element, surrounded by blinking server lights and the low hum of industrial cooling fans. My first instinct, the one most corporate executives would follow, would be to immediately dial 911. I could have dispatched the Atlanta Police Department to my building in under 3 minutes. I could have had my sister dragged out of my facility in handcuffs, crying and screaming in the back of a squad car for felony breaking and entering. It would have been entirely justified. But I knew my family dynamic far too well to settle for such a simple, quiet victory. If I had her arrested in the middle of the night, my mother would spend the rest of her life spinning a narrative of victimhood. Brenda would tell our entire extended family and her church congregation that I had maliciously trapped my sister. She would claim Chloe had simply forgotten her keys, or that I had invited her over just to set her up. They would hire expensive defense attorneys using whatever credit Julian had left, and they would paint me as the jealous, vindictive younger sister who wanted to ruin the golden child. I could not allow them to control the story anymore. To permanently destroy the delusions of a narcissist, you cannot defeat them in the shadows. You have to let them take the center stage. You have to give them enough rope to build their own gallows, and then you have to let them pull the lever themselves in front of an audience they desperately respect. I watched the screen intently as Chloe approached the main engineering console. I had anticipated her desperation the moment she snatched that access badge from my desk earlier that morning. I knew she would come looking for a physical drive to steal, entirely ignorant of the fact that enterprise data of this magnitude is never stored on a single removable device. But Chloe was a corporate suit, not a hardware engineer. She saw the world exactly how she wanted to see it. Sitting perfectly centered on the sleek metal console was a solid-state external hard drive. It was entirely real, but I had deliberately placed it there before I left for the evening. Sticking to the top of the brushed aluminum casing was a crisp white physical label that read, "Sterling Corporation, European Block, Decrypted Data." On the video feed, I saw Chloe spot the drive. Her entire body sagged with a massive visible wave of relief. She practically lunged for the console. Her trembling hands reached out and snatched the hard drive, clutching it to her chest as if she had just found the Holy Grail. A triumphant, arrogant smile spread across her face, completely erasing the terror from just moments before. In her mind, she had just won. She believed she had successfully outsmarted her lowly sister, saved her lucrative career, and secured her highly coveted promotion to senior partner. She had restored the natural order of the universe where she was the undisputed winner, and I was the absolute loser. She quickly shoved the drive deep into the pocket of her designer jacket, zipped it up securely, and turned around. She hurried back down the center aisle, swiping the stolen contractor badge to exit the server bay, and slipped out the side door of the facility. I switched the camera feed to the exterior street view and watched her jog across the dark pavement to her luxury sedan parked under a broken streetlight. She climbed into the driver's seat, the headlights flashed on, and the vehicle sped off into the Atlanta night. She had the drive, but she had absolutely no idea what was actually on it. It did not contain a single kilobyte of Richard Sterling's decrypted corporate data. It was a digital honeypot, a customized trap I had personally coded and prepared specifically for this exact moment. Chloe thought she was bringing Richard the keys to his salvation, but she was actually carrying a highly volatile digital bomb straight into his boardroom. I closed the security application on my tablet and set the device down. I picked up my teacup and finished the last drops of the warm, soothing chamomile. The absolute silence of my penthouse was beautiful. I had survived a lifetime of their psychological warfare, their cruel jokes, and their relentless manipulation. Tomorrow, the war would finally end, and it would end on my exact terms. I picked up my cell phone and opened my contact list. It was well past midnight, but billionaires facing the total collapse of their global trading blocks do not sleep. I tapped Richard Sterling's direct private number and brought the phone to my ear. The line rang twice before he answered. His voice was thick with exhaustion and stress. "Emma," he said, clearly surprised to hear from me at this hour. "Tell me you have good news. Tell me your team cracked the encryption." I kept my voice perfectly level, projecting absolute confidence into the quiet night. "Richard," I said smoothly. The presentation is completely ready. I need you to contact your executive board immediately. Tell your board of directors to convene in your main conference room tomorrow at exactly 12 noon. I heard him let out a massive sigh of relief on the other end of the line. Thank God, Emma. I will have my assistants notify the board right now. I cannot thank you enough for saving us. I will see you tomorrow at noon. I paused for a brief, calculated second before delivering the final instruction of the night. I will be there, Richard, I replied. But this is crucial. You need to make absolutely sure that your vice president of acquisitions is there too. Make sure my sister is presenting the data to the board. I arrived at the towering glass and steel headquarters of Sterling Corporation at exactly 15 minutes before noon. The main lobby was a sprawling expanse of white marble and cascading water features designed to intimidate anyone who walked through the front doors. But I was completely unfazed. I bypassed the main reception desk and approached the private executive elevators. My lead legal counsel, a brilliant and fiercely sharp woman named Sarah, walked confidently by my side. Flanking us was a federal corporate espionage auditor I had retained early that morning. We rode the silent elevator all the way up to the 65th floor, where the air was noticeably thinner and the stakes were infinitely higher. When the elevator doors parted, we stepped into the plushly carpeted anteroom just outside the main executive boardroom. The heavy oak double doors of the conference room were pulled shut, but they featured narrow vertical panels of frosted glass. By standing just to the side of the entrance, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the entire room without being seen. I crossed my arms and settled in to watch the final act of my sister's magnificent delusion unfold. The ultra-modern boardroom was a massive, intimidating space. A long custom mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by leather executive chairs. The entire back wall was a continuous pane of glass, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. Seated around the table were the 12 members of the Sterling Corporation Board of Directors. These were incredibly powerful, impatient billionaires who were currently losing millions of dollars every hour their European trading bloc remained offline. At the head of the table sat Richard Sterling, his face drawn tight with stress and sleeplessness. He was drumming his fingers nervously against the polished wood, waiting for his salvation. And standing right next to him, basking in the glow of the massive high-definition presentation screens, was my sister Chloe. She had dressed for absolute victory. She wore a tailored crimson power suit that screamed authority and demanded attention. Her hair was styled with meticulous perfection, and she carried herself with a posture so straight and arrogant, she practically looked a foot taller. She was radiating a toxic, blinding confidence. In her mind, the nightmare was over. She was not the desperate thief who had sneaked into my facility in the dead of night. She was the brilliant, aggressive vice president of acquisitions who had just single-handedly saved a multinational conglomerate from total disaster. I shifted my gaze to the back of the room. Sitting in the leather gallery chairs reserved for guests and supporting staff was Julian. He was wearing an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, his legs crossed casually at the knee. He looked incredibly smug, a self-satisfied smirk permanently etched across his pale face. Watching him sit there projecting the illusion of a wealthy Wall Street titan was almost comical. I knew for an absolute fact that his hedge fund was completely dead in the water. His trading algorithms were blind, and he was completely bankrupt. But Julian was playing a part. He genuinely believed that his frivolous lawsuit the day before had terrified me into submission. He assumed that his legal threats had broken my resolve, forcing me to surrender the recovered data directly to his wife. He was sitting in that room fully expecting to ride Chloe's coattails out of his financial ruin. Chloe cleared her throat, placing her hands flat on the edge of the mahogany table, mirroring the exact authoritative posture she had tried to use on me in my office. The dull murmur of the board members immediately silenced. "Gentlemen," Chloe began, her voice projecting loudly and clearly across the expansive room. "I know the past 48 hours have been incredibly stressful for this firm. The ransomware attack on our European servers was unprecedented. As you know, we initially consulted with external vendors who attempted to extort this board for $10 million in emergency recovery fees. I listened to her brazenly rewrite history, feeling a cold, clinical fascination. She was actively painting me as a predatory villain, attempting to hold the company hostage, all while positioning herself as the loyal corporate soldier. But I am incredibly proud to announce that Sterling Corporation will not be paying that extortion fee. Chloe continued, her voice swelling with manufactured pride. My acquisitions department took the initiative. We worked around the clock, utilizing our own internal resources and a network of proprietary backdoors. We bypassed the external hardware specialists completely. We have successfully decrypted the European trading bloc. A collective sigh of relief washed over the board of directors. Several of the older men at the table actually smiled and nodded their heads in profound approval. Julian clapped his hands together, once a loud, sharp sound of arrogant support from the back of the room. Chloe beamed, soaking up the validation like a sponge. This was the absolute peak of her hubris. This was the moment she had chased her entire life. She was standing at the summit of her corporate mountain, wearing my success as her own personal costume. It was a masterclass in psychological delusion. She had spent our entire childhood stealing the credit for my accomplishments. She had taken my science fair projects and put her name on them. She had spent my college savings to buy her Ivy League status. She was so completely accustomed to stealing my labor that she genuinely believed she could steal a military-grade decryption drive walk into a boardroom full of billionaires and simply claim the victory. She felt no guilt. She felt no fear. She was absolutely certain she had beaten me once again. She reached into the pocket of her crimson jacket and pulled out the silver solid-state drive. She held it up high, letting the overhead lights catch the brushed aluminum casing so every single board member could see it. It was the digital honeypot I had left on my console. "We have the entire European bloc right here," Chloe announced, her smile wide and triumphant, ready to be uploaded directly back into the mainframe. Richard Sterling let out a deep, shaking breath, running a hand through his silver hair. He looked at Chloe not with the disgust he had shown her in the steakhouse, but with genuine, profound gratitude. He believed she had miraculously delivered on her promise. "Outstanding work," Chloe Richard said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You have absolutely saved this quarter. Please plug the drive into the central console. Let us initiate the data transfer and get our European markets back online right now." Chloe offered a crisp, professional nod. She turned toward the main presentation computer integrated into the boardroom wall, gripping the silver hard drive tightly in her manicured hand. Her entire future, her senior partnership, and her golden child status were just one click away. She reached out toward the USB terminal. Just as Richard leaned forward in his chair to watch the screens, I placed both of my hands firmly against the heavy oak boardroom doors and pushed them wide open. The heavy oak doors swung inward with a resounding crack that echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous boardroom. 12 billionaires' men who were accustomed to the entire world waiting on their explicit permission to speak instantly snapped their heads toward the entrance. The collective murmur of the room died immediately. The silence that fell over the space was absolute and heavy, thick with the scent of expensive cologne, dark roasted coffee, and polished mahogany. I stepped across the threshold, my expensive heels clicking with a steady, lethal rhythm against the hardwood floor. Flanked by Sarah, my lead legal counsel, and the stern-faced federal auditor, I did not pause to wait for an invitation to enter. I walked directly into the center of the room. This was a space built entirely by old money, saturated in the kind of systemic privilege that usually required a specific bloodline and a trust fund to access. As a self-made Black woman in the technology sector, I had spent my entire career navigating rooms exactly like this one. I knew exactly how these men operated. They respected power, but they only yielded to absolute leverage. Right now, standing under the bright recessed lighting of their own corporate fortress, I was the only person in the room holding any real leverage. I owned the space completely. Richard Sterling stood up from his leather executive chair at the head of the massive table. He looked completely bewildered. He glanced from my face to the stern expressions of my legal team and then back to my sister standing near the presentation screen. Emma Richard said, his voice hesitant but entirely respectful, ensuring he did not offend the only person who could save his company. What is the meaning of this? We were just about to initiate the data transfer. Is there a problem with the contract parameters we discussed last night on the phone? Before I could even open my mouth to answer him, Chloe completely panicked. The tailored crimson power suit that had made her look so commanding just seconds ago suddenly seemed to swallow her whole. The color violently drained from her meticulously contoured face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. She knew how I operated, and she knew I would not walk into a room like this unless I had a checkmate already planned. But her desperate need to maintain the illusion of control overpowered her basic survival instincts. She took a rapid step forward, physically placing herself between me and the billionaire executive sitting at the table. "Excuse me," Chloe snapped, forcing her voice into a shrill, authoritative register that completely lacked its previous warmth. "This is a highly classified internal board meeting for Sterling Corporation executives only. You do not have the security clearance to be in this room. I am going to have to ask you to leave immediately before I call building security to have you escorted out." I did not stop walking until I was standing exactly 3 feet away from her. The height difference between us was negligible, but the shift in gravity was monumental. I looked at her, truly looked at the desperate, sweating woman hiding behind a fancy title, and felt nothing but a cold, clinical pity. "You are not going to call security, Chloe?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly across the dead-silent boardroom. "Because building security is currently downstairs turning over the access logs of every single door you opened last night to the Atlanta Police Department." In the back row of the gallery seating, Julian let out a sharp, audible gasp. He gripped the armrests of his leather guest chair so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white. He shifted uncomfortably in his navy blue suit, his arrogant smirk entirely erased. He knew instantly that his wife had crossed a line that neither of them possessed the capital or the legal power to defend. Richard frowned, his sharp blue eyes darting frantically between us. "Emma, what are you talking about?" "Chloe just informed the board that her department decrypted the European servers using internal resources. She has the data drive right in her hand. We are minutes away from reopening the trading block." I shifted my gaze back to the billionaire chief executive. "Richard," I said calmly, gesturing to the man standing tall to my right. "This is Special Agent Harris, a federal corporate espionage auditor, and this is Sarah Vance, my lead corporate counsel. We are standing in your boardroom today because less than 12 hours ago, your vice president of acquisitions illegally accessed my private military-grade data facility. She used a stolen contractor badge to bypass my exterior biometric security grid, and she stole a piece of proprietary hardware directly from my engineering bay." The boardroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. Several of the older board members leaned forward in their heavy leather chairs, staring at Chloe, as if she had just morphed into a dangerous criminal right before their eyes. The pristine corporate savior narrative she had just spent 10 minutes building evaporated into thin air. "That is an absolute lie," Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking under the immense, crushing pressure of the room. She gripped the silver hard drive so tightly against her chest her hands were violently shaking. "She is lying, Richard. She is just jealous. She has been jealous of my career my entire life, and now she is trying to ruin me because I figured out how to bypass her ridiculous extortion fee. This drive contains our data. I recovered it myself. She is trying to steal my credit." She was doubling down on a losing hand, clinging desperately to a reality that was rapidly disintegrating around her. She looked at the board members, her eyes wide and pleading, begging them to believe her fabricated narrative of the jealous, vindictive sister who just wanted to ruin the family golden child. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice to defend my character, nor did I present my security footage to the board. I did not need to. I simply stepped aside, clearing the physical path between Chloe and the main presentation computer integrated into the sleek mahogany wall. I extended my arm, gesturing gracefully toward the USB terminal waiting below the massive screens. "Go ahead, Chloe," I said, my voice ringing with absolute terrifying certainty. "Show the board what you recovered." Chloe stared at me, her chest heaving with ragged, panicked breaths. She looked into my eyes, desperately searching for any sign of hesitation, any subtle indication that I was bluffing to save face. But I offered her absolutely nothing. I stood perfectly still, a calm and impenetrable fortress. In her twisted, arrogant mind, my silence was not a trap. She interpreted it as defeat. She genuinely believed that I was trying to intimidate her into backing down because I had no actual proof of her midnight break-in. A vicious, triumphant sneer curled her lips. She turned her back to me, gripping the silver hard drive with renewed arrogant purpose. "Watch closely, Emma," Chloe hissed over her shoulder, her voice dripping with venom. "This is what real success looks like." She marched the final 2 steps to the presentation console. With a sharp, aggressive thrust, she jammed the solid-state drive into the primary USB terminal. She reached out with her manicured hand, wrapping her fingers around the wireless presentation mouse resting on the polished mahogany desk. On the massive 80-inch high-definition screens spanning the entire front wall of the boardroom, a digital folder popped up. It was labeled with the Sterling Corporation logo and the words "European Block Decrypted Data." Chloe clicked the folder open without a single second of hesitation. The screens went completely black. For 2 agonizingly long seconds, the boardroom was plunged into an eerie digital darkness. Richard Sterling leaned forward, his brow furrowing in confusion. The other billionaires at the table shifted in their heavy leather chairs, murmuring quietly to one another. Chloe frantically clicked the mouse again, a sudden spike of anxiety breaking through her confident facade. Then the massive screens did not load the complex financial data of the European trading bloc. Instead, they violently flashed a brilliant, blinding crimson red. A custom interface that I had personally designed illuminated the room, casting a harsh red glow over the faces of the most powerful men in Atlanta. The Sterling Corporation logo was nowhere to be found. In its place was a meticulously organized automated scrolling ledger. The digital trap I had planted on that drive the night before had worked flawlessly. When Chloe had foolishly plugged the honeypot drive into her own unsecured home computer to check its contents hours earlier, my hidden executable script had instantly bypassed her basic firewalls, ripped every single file from her local hard drive, cross-referenced it with Julian's financial records, and formatted the most damning evidence into a pristine presentation. The boardroom watched in absolute paralyzed silence as Chloe and Julian's private correspondence began to scroll across the 80-inch monitors in massive, undeniable text. There were no encrypted server logs. There were only emails, hundreds of them. The first email on the screen was dated 2 years ago. The subject line read, "Urgent margin call transfer." It was sent directly from Julian's private hedge fund account to Chloe's secure corporate address. The text was incredibly explicit. Julian was begging his wife to authorize a fraudulent vendor payment from her acquisitions department to cover his failing crypto investments. Right below it was Chloe's reply, stamped with the official Sterling Corporation time code. It read, "Invoice approved. Funneling the excess $200,000 into the Delaware Shell account now. Do not mess this up, Julian." The scrolling continued, relentlessly exposing their massive criminal conspiracy. The screen displayed forged invoice receipts, falsified acquisition reports, and direct wire transfer routing numbers. It painted a devastating, highly detailed picture of a 2-year-long embezzlement scheme. Chloe had been systematically using her authority as vice president to inflate the cost of corporate buyouts, slicing the excess millions off the top and quietly feeding them into Julian's bankrupt hedge fund just to maintain their lavish lifestyle. They were entirely funding their country club memberships, their designer wardrobes, and their luxury vehicles with money stolen directly from the men sitting in that exact room. The collective gasp that erupted from the 12 board members was a sound of pure, unadulterated outrage. These were self-made billionaires and ruthless venture capitalists. They did not tolerate incompetence, but they absolutely destroyed thieves. Richard Sterling stood up so fast his heavy leather chair violently tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck stood out like thick cords. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at the massive red screens, his eyes wide with a terrifying rage. "What is this?" Richard roared, his voice shaking the very foundation of the room. "You have been stealing from my company. You have been siphoning my funds to cover your pathetic husband's gambling debts." Chloe dropped the presentation mouse. It clattered loudly against the desk and fell to the floor, shattering into pieces. She stumbled backward, her hands flying up to cover her face as if the bright red light radiating from the screens was physically burning her skin. She was completely trapped. There was no clever corporate spin that could save her. There was no mother in the room to blindly defend her. Her exact words, her exact routing numbers, and her exact crimes were actively broadcasting in 4K resolution to the federal corporate espionage auditor standing right next to me. She looked at Richard, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Mr. Sterling, please," she choked out, tears instantly streaming down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her makeup. "It is a mistake. The data is altered. She hacked me. My sister hacked me to frame me." Special Agent Harris stepped forward, his voice calm, deep, and completely devoid of sympathy. "Actually, ma'am, I have already pulled the server metadata from your corporate account. The timestamps on these emails match your internal server logs perfectly. This is not a fabrication. This is a confession." In the back row of the gallery, the reality of the situation crashed down on Julian with the force of a freight train. The arrogant smirk he had worn for 34 years vanished permanently. He was not just broke anymore. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. The deep pockets and white shoe lawyers he loved to brag about could not save him from stealing millions from Richard Sterling. The primal instinct of a cornered coward violently kicked in. Julian leaped out of his guest chair. He did not look at his wife. He did not attempt to defend the woman he had conspired with. He abandoned Chloe completely. He spun around his expensive leather shoes, slipping frantically against the polished floor, and bolted directly for the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom. He was desperately trying to run. But the moment he reached the exit, the doors swung inward, and my massive security detail stepped directly into his path. Julian slammed hard into the solid wall of my private security detail. The two massive former military contractors did not even flinch. They grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive navy blue suit and shoved him forcefully back into the boardroom. He stumbled backward, his leather shoes skidding across the polished hardwood until he collapsed back into his guest chair. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched sob. The great Wall Street titan, the man who had mocked my career and threatened to destroy my company with endless litigation, had been reduced to a weeping coward in a matter of seconds. I walked calmly to the head of the mahogany table, commanding the absolute attention of every single billionaire in the room. I looked directly at Richard Sterling. "What you are seeing on those screens, Richard, is the exact result of a targeted digital honeypot." I explained the chain of custody with surgical precision. I told the board how Chloe had stolen a temporary contractor badge from my desk yesterday morning. I detailed how she used that stolen badge to breach my secondary server bay at exactly 12:14 this morning. "She was desperately looking for your decrypted European market data," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level. "But enterprise servers do not work like that." Instead, she found the physical hard drive I left completely unsecured on the engineering console. When she took that drive home and plugged it into her personal computer, she activated an executable script I wrote specifically for her. The room was completely spellbound as I broke down the trap. The drive immediately bypassed her basic residential firewalls, accessed her local storage, and ripped every single unencrypted file related to her financial accounts. It then formatted those stolen emails and forged invoices into the presentation you are currently watching. My federal auditor, Special Agent Harris, already holds the certified biometric access logs and the high-definition security footage of her midnight heist. The chain of custody is absolute legally binding and ready for federal prosecution. Richard Sterling turned his gaze from the massive red screens down to my sister. The sheer magnitude of his fury seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. Chloe was backed up against the presentation console. Her crimson power suit was completely wrinkled, and her mascara was running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. She held her hands out in front of her, desperately trying to formulate a defense, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She could only produce wet, gasping sounds. "You arrogant, parasitic thief!" Richard roared. His voice boomed with the authority of a man who could destroy lives with a single phone call. "You sat in my office and demanded a promotion to senior partner while you were actively bleeding my company dry to pay for your husband's failures. You are fired, Chloe, effective immediately. You are permanently stripped of your title, your stock options are voided, and your corporate access is terminated. Do not ever speak to me or anyone at this firm again." Richard did not stop there. He spun around and pointed directly at his lead corporate attorney sitting halfway down the long table. "Get the FBI field office on the phone right now," Richard commanded. "I want federal wire fraud and grand larceny charges filed before lunch. Freeze every single one of their bank accounts, seize their property assets, and bury them so deep in federal litigation they never see the sun again." Watching Chloe in that moment was like watching a perfectly constructed glass sculpture shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The golden child facade, the pristine corporate savior identity, the arrogant superiority she had wielded like a weapon against me my entire life, it was all completely obliterated. She dropped to her knees right there on the expensive boardroom carpet. She clasped her hands together openly, weeping and begging the billionaires for a second chance. She was pleading for mercy from men who possessed absolutely none. For 35 years, my family had designated me as the scapegoat. They had convinced themselves that my independence was a flaw and my labor was a joke. But sitting in the ruins of her own hubris, Chloe was finally experiencing the exact same humiliation and powerlessness she had subjected me to her entire life. There was no mother in the room to blindly defend her. There was no stolen college fund to bail her out. She was entirely alone with the consequences of her own actions. Richard signaled for the building security team waiting in the hallway. 4 uniformed guards marched into the boardroom. They grabbed Julian by the arms, hauling the sobbing hedge fund manager to his feet without an ounce of gentleness. 2 other guards approached Chloe. She went completely limp, refusing to stand, forcing the large men to physically drag her across the floor. She screamed hysterically, her designer heels dragging awkwardly behind her on the thick carpet. I followed the procession out of the boardroom, stepping onto the massive executive elevator as the guards hauled my sister and brother-in-law inside. Special Agent Harris stood silently by my side. We descended 65 floors in total silence, save for Chloe's frantic hyperventilating and Julian's muffled crying. The polished steel elevator doors finally opened to the expansive white marble of the main lobby. The entire ground floor was packed with corporate employees heading out for their lunch breaks. Hundreds of people stopped dead in their tracks, conversations halting mid-sentence. They watched in absolute shock as the prestigious vice president of acquisitions was dragged out by security like a common vagrant. The murmurs and whispers rippled through the massive lobby, sealing her public humiliation permanently into the corporate history of the firm. And just as the guards hauled Chloe toward the front glass exit, the massive revolving doors spun violently. My mother Brenda burst into the lobby. She was clutching her designer handbag, her eyes frantically searching the crowded atrium. She had arrived just in time to witness the spectacular public ruin of her perfect daughter. 3 weeks passed since the spectacular collapse of my sister in the lobby of Sterling Corporation. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely public. Chloe was hit with a massive federal indictment for wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. Every single one of her bank accounts was frozen by the government. Her luxury vehicles were repossessed in the middle of the night. And Julian, the arrogant hedge fund manager, who swore family protected family, did exactly what cowards do when they are cornered. He filed for divorce the very next morning. He completely threw Chloe under the bus, actively cooperating with federal prosecutors in a desperate attempt to reduce his own prison sentence. I, on the other hand, spent those 3 weeks successfully executing the most lucrative contract of my career. My engineering team rebuilt the European trading bloc architecture ahead of schedule. Richard Sterling wired the $10 million payment to my corporate account, along with a massive performance bonus and a personal note of gratitude. I was standing in the kitchen of my downtown penthouse, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline when my private intercom buzzed. My concierge informed me that my mother was waiting in the lobby. I authorized her access, genuinely curious to see what kind of narrative she had spun to justify this visit. The private elevator doors opened directly into my living room. Brenda stepped out, and for a moment I almost did not recognize her. The pristine country club matriarch was entirely gone. She looked 10 years older. Her posture was stooped, her expensive clothes looked slightly rumpled, and the heavy bags under her eyes told the story of sleepless nights and endless legal consultations. But the moment her eyes locked onto mine, I saw the exact same toxic entitlement burning brightly in her gaze. She did not greet me. She did not ask how I was doing. She walked across the imported hardwood floor, aggressively taking in the sheer wealth of my home, the custom furniture, the original artwork, and the undeniable proof of my success. "I know you got the Sterling contract," Brenda said, her voice raspy but demanding. Her opening line was not an apology, it was a financial assessment. "I know Richard paid you $10 million. Your sister is facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary, Emma. The public defender they assigned to her is completely useless. The best criminal defense firm in the city requires a $500,000 retainer just to look at her case files. I need you to wire the money today." I stood completely still, resting my hand on the cool surface of my marble kitchen island. The absolute magnitude of her delusion was almost fascinating to witness. She had watched her golden child illegally break into my business. She had seen the undeniable proof that her favorite daughter and perfect son-in-law had stolen her entire retirement fund. She had literally threatened to leave me penniless just weeks prior. Yet here she was, standing in my sanctuary, demanding I use the money I earned to rescue the woman who tried to destroy me. "You are not actually asking me for a favor." "Mother," I noted, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "You are giving me an order. She is your flesh and blood," Brenda snapped, stepping closer, desperately trying to weaponize the concept of family one last time. "You have more money than you could ever spend. It is your duty to help her. If she goes to federal prison, her life is entirely over. You have made your point, Emma. You proved you are successful. Now it is time to drop this petty grudge and write the check. We are family, and family takes care of its own." I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, searching deep within myself for any lingering trace of the frightened little girl who used to beg for her approval. There was absolutely nothing left. The psychological cord had been permanently severed. In that quiet, defining moment, the ultimate realization washed over me. Brenda was never going to change. She was completely incapable of loving me for who I was. In her mind, my brilliant tech career, my hard work, and my millions of dollars were simply resources meant to be harvested for Chloe's benefit. I was not a daughter to her. I was an emergency bank account. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply turned my back on her and walked over to my custom wine refrigerator. I pulled out a vintage bottle of Cabernet that cost more than her current monthly rent. I picked up a crystal wine glass, uncorked the bottle, and slowly poured myself a generous measure. The rich ruby liquid swirled against the glass as I took a deep, calming sip. I turned back around, leaned casually against the marble counter, and finally gave my mother the exact answer she deserved. I placed the crystal wine glass down on the marble counter. The sharp clink echoed in the massive quiet space of my penthouse. "No," I said softly. It was a single powerful syllable delivered with the absolute calm of a woman who no longer feared the consequences of her own boundaries. Brenda blinked, her face contorting as if I had just slapped her. "What do you mean, no?" she demanded, her voice trembling with rising panic. "I just told you your sister is going to prison. She will not survive a federal facility, Emma. You have $10 million sitting in your account. 500,000 is nothing to you. You are going to write that check right now." I crossed my arms, looking at her with a profound, clinical detachment. "I am not going to give you a single dime." "Mother," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "And the absolute tragedy here is that you still do not understand why. You genuinely believe I am holding on to a petty grudge. You think I am refusing to pay for her defense attorney because I am jealous or angry about that stupid dinner at the steakhouse. But that is not it at all. I am not writing that check because I am finally refusing to fund your toxic delusions." I took a step forward, closing the distance between us, forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. "You do not love Chloe," I stated, my words slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. "You have never actually loved her. You loved the pristine, perfect image she provided for you. You loved bragging about her Wharton degree to your country club friends. You loved the prestige of her corporate title. You loved the aesthetic of her marriage to a wealthy white hedge fund manager. You worshipped her proximity to power so much that you completely ignored the monster she was becoming." Brenda opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer force of my convictions silenced her. "When I was 18 years old, I continued, my voice steady and unwavering. I worked double shifts at a diner to save for college. You forced me out of our home because I refused to surrender my blood and sweat to pay for Chloe's Ivy League tuition. You demanded that I sacrifice my future so she could have an easier path. You shielded her from every single consequence, every single struggle, and every single failure. You taught her that the rules did not apply to her, and you taught her that my boundaries did not matter." I gestured toward the panoramic window out toward the city where Chloe was currently awaiting her federal trial. "You built this exact reality, Mother. Your relentless enabling is what ultimately put Chloe in a federal holding cell. She felt completely comfortable stealing millions of dollars from a billionaire because you spent 35 years teaching her that she was entitled to whatever she wanted. She stole your entire retirement fund to cover Julian's massive debts, and you still stood in my office and defended her. You built a golden pedestal for a thief, and now you are angry that it collapsed under the weight of her own crimes." The heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood finally lifted off my shoulders. I was reclaiming my narrative. For decades, I had carried the burden of being the family scapegoat. I had internalized their cruel jokes, their dismissive remarks, and their blatant favoritism. I had spent countless nights wondering what was fundamentally wrong with me, wondering why my own mother could look at me with such cold indifference. But standing in my penthouse surrounded by an empire I built with my own two hands, I finally understood the truth. I was never the problem. I was simply the mirror that reflected their profound emptiness, and they absolutely hated me for it. Brenda stared at me, her lower lip trembling violently. The aggressive, demanding matriarch had completely vanished. She was stripped of her leverage, her stolen wealth, and her delusions of control. She finally realized that the daughter she had thrown away was the only one who could have saved her, and she had permanently burned that bridge to the ground. For the first time in my entire life, I saw genuine, unmanipulated tears spill over her eyelashes and stream down her weathered cheeks. She was crying because she was entirely powerless. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not step forward to comfort her. I walked past her, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, and I placed my hand on the heavy brass handle of my front door. I pulled it wide open, revealing the quiet, brightly lit corridor of the penthouse floor. "It is time for you to leave, Mother," I said, my voice projecting a calm, absolute finality. "I want you to walk out of this door, take the elevator down to the lobby, and never contact me again. Do not call my phone. Do not send emails to my corporate office. Do not attempt to use my address for any of your impending bankruptcy filings. When Chloe's federal trial begins, Do not expect me to sit in the gallery and pretend to support her. I am officially resigning from this family." Brenda let out a ragged, heartbreaking sob. She looked at the open doorway, then looked back at me, her eyes pleading for a mercy she had never once extended to me. "Emma, please," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her total ruin. "You are my daughter. You are the only family I have left." "I was your daughter when you watched Julian mock me in that restaurant," I replied coldly. "I was your daughter when you threatened to cut me out of an empty trust fund. You only remember we are family when you run out of other people to use." "Goodbye, Brenda." She stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment, desperately hoping I would break. But my expression remained an impenetrable fortress. Slowly, painfully, she picked up her designer handbag, her shoulders slumped forward, completely defeated. She walked past me, her steps heavy and slow, carrying the crushing weight of her own catastrophic failures. She stepped out into the hallway, not daring to look back at me one last time. I grabbed the heavy brass handle and pushed the door shut. The solid oak slammed into the frame with a loud, resounding thud. I reached up and turned the deadbolt. The sharp mechanical click echoed through my entryway, sealing the physical and emotional boundary permanently. The toxic tie was completely severed. They were gone. I stood in the silence of my home for a few moments, letting the profound, beautiful peace wash over me. The air in my penthouse suddenly felt lighter, cleaner, and infinitely easier to breathe. I walked back into my living room, picked up my glass of vintage Cabernet, and moved gracefully toward the massive glass doors leading out to my private balcony. I slid the glass open and stepped out into the warm Atlanta night. The city was alive with glowing lights, a sprawling grid of endless possibilities and immense power. I rested my forearms against the cool glass railing, looking out over the empire I had conquered. Down below, millions of people were living their lives completely unaware of the quiet, devastating corporate execution I had orchestrated over the last month. I pulled my sleek smartphone from my pocket and unlocked the screen. I did not have any missed calls or threatening text messages from Julian. I did not have any manipulative voicemails from my sister. I opened my encrypted banking application and looked at my corporate accounts. The balance was staggering. The $10 million payment from Sterling Corporation had officially cleared, bringing my firm's total valuation into a stratosphere my family could never even comprehend. But as I stared at those massive numbers, I realized they were no longer just currency. They were undeniable proof of my brilliance, my resilience, and my absolute refusal to be broken by people who wanted me to stay small. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I took a deep breath of the crisp night air, savoring the taste of my expensive wine. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my entire life. The best revenge against toxic family members is not screaming matches or physical altercations. The ultimate revenge is unparalleled, undeniable success. It is building a life so magnificent and so loud that the people who doubted you are completely deafened by your triumphs. I had survived their abuse, I had outsmarted their sabotage, and I had emerged completely victorious on my own exact terms. Exact. Sometimes the trash simply takes itself out, and when it does, all you have to do is lock the door, pour a glass of wine, and enjoy the beautiful, thriving silence they leave behind. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life to protect your peace, let me know in the comments below. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that walking away from abuse is the most powerful move you can ever make. Stay strong, protect your energy, and remember that your success is entirely in your own hands.